I remember the day I discovered the truth as if it were yesterday. The sharp sting of betrayal still lingers, a ghost that haunts the corners of my mind when least expected. It was a chilly morning in late October, the kind where the sky is a flat, unending gray, and the air seems thick with the promise of rain. I had just returned from the grocery store, my hands full of bags that seemed heavier than usual, though I suppose that's the way of burdens. They grow in weight when your spirit is low. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the front door of our modest suburban home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels intrusive, as if it were waiting to pounce with bad news. I shook the thought from my mind, chastising myself for being overly dramatic. My husband, Michael, was likely just upstairs in his office, lost in one of the many projects that always seemed to consume him. Once inside, I made my way to the kitchen, setting the bags down with a sigh. The usual routine of unpacking and putting away groceries was comforting in its mundanity, a small oasis of normalcy in an increasingly unpredictable life. But as I reached for the last bag, my phone buzzed on the counter, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering, the voice on the other end tense and unfamiliar. "Is this Mrs. Thompson?" the caller asked, her tone polite but direct. "Yes, this is she," I replied, feeling a slight tremor in my voice. "I'm calling from Glenwood High School. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding regarding the upcoming charity auction." The woman on the line went on to explain that my husband had promised a significant donation on our behalf, a sum far beyond what we could comfortably afford. As she spoke, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This was not the first financial misstep Michael had made, but it was certainly one of the most audacious. After ending the call, I stood there for a moment, staring at the kitchen wall, my mind racing. Michael's recent behavior had been erratic at best, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he had let on. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I made my way upstairs to his office, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The door was ajar, and I paused for a moment before pushing it open, the sight that greeted me both unexpected and unsettling. Michael was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, surrounded by a sea of paperwork that looked more chaotic than organized. He didn't notice me at first, and I took the opportunity to study him, trying to reconcile this man with the one I thought I knew. "Michael," I said softly, my voice startling us both. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, and I saw a flicker of guilt flash across his face before he quickly masked it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, honey," he said, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. "Didn't hear you come in." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I just got off the phone with someone from Glenwood High School. They mentioned a rather generous donation you pledged on our behalf." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I had come to recognize over our years together. "Oh, that," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "It's nothing really, just a little mix-up. I'll handle it." But his words did nothing to ease the knot forming in my stomach. "Michael, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. What's going on?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, and I knew then that my instincts had been right. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that went beyond mere financial irresponsibility. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until finally he sighed and looked up at me. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice low and strained. "But it's not what you think." I listened as he spoke, his words a tangled web of half-truths and evasions that only served to heighten my suspicions. He claimed that the donation was part of a larger business deal, one that had gone south unexpectedly. But as he talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that this was merely the tip of an iceberg I had yet to fully uncover. In the days that followed, I found myself in a state of constant vigilance, scrutinizing every word, every action, every interaction for clues to the truth. It was during one such moment of scrutiny that I stumbled upon the first real piece of evidence, a crumpled piece of paper tucked away in the back of Michael's desk drawer. It was a betting slip, the The kind used in those underground gambling rings I had heard about, but never imagined Michael would be involved in. The amount was staggering, a figure so high it made my breath catch in my throat. As I stared at the slip, a cold realization settled over me. The "is" was the source of our financial woes, the reason behind Michael's increasingly erratic behavior. Confronting him was a decision I didn't take lightly, but one I knew was necessary. When I finally did, his reaction was one of denial, and then, slowly, reluctant admission. The truth came tumbling out in fits and starts, each new revelation more shocking than the last. He had been drawn into the world of high-stakes gambling through a group of friends, men I had met at various social gatherings and never thought twice about. It was supposed to be harmless fun, a way to blow off steam and indulge in a bit of risk. But what had started as a small pastime had quickly spiraled into something much darker and more dangerous. The final blow came when he admitted that the bet had not just been about money. It was a dare, a twisted game among so-called friends to see who could convince their spouse to agree to the most outrageous financial commitment. I stood there, numb and disbelieving, as he tried to justify his actions, painting himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. In that moment, something inside me broke. The betrayal was complete, not just of our marriage, but of the trust and love I had once believed to be unshakable. I walked away from him then, needing space to process what I had learned, to decide what my next steps would be. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, a tumultuous storm of anger, grief, and confusion. Friends I had thought were ours turned out to be more his than mine, their loyalty proving to be as fickle as the promises Michael had made. The isolation was palpable, a silence that echoed with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved conflicts. But in the midst of the chaos, a surprising ally emerged. Claire, a neighbor and casual acquaintance, reached out with a kindness that was both unexpected and deeply needed. She had heard whispers of what had happened through the suburban grapevine, a network of gossip and speculation that thrived on scandal. But rather than judge or condemn, she offered a listening ear and a shoulder to lean on, a lifeline in an ocean of uncertainty. Claire's own story was one I had only known in passing, snippets shared at neighborhood gatherings and casual conversations over coffee. She was a widow, her husband having passed away years earlier from a sudden heart attack. Despite the loss, she had managed to build a life for herself, one marked by resilience and quiet strength. Her presence was a balm, her words a reminder that I was not alone in my struggles. As I navigated the aftermath of Michael's betrayal, Claire's support became a crucial part of my journey. Through her, I began to see a path forward, one that involved not just surviving, but thriving in the face of adversity. It was a slow process, fraught with setbacks and moments of doubt, but with her guidance, I found the courage to take the first tentative steps toward reclaiming my life. It was during one of our many conversations that Claire mentioned someone who would change the course of my life in ways I could never have imagined. "You should meet Jonathan," she said one afternoon as we sat in her cozy living room, the autumn light casting warm shadows across the walls. "He's an old friend of mine, someone who knows a thing or two about starting over." I was hesitant at first, wary of new connections in the wake of so much upheaval. But Claire's insistence, coupled with a growing curiosity, eventually led me to agree. Little did I know that meeting Jonathan would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the power of second chances. It had been 3 months since the night that shattered my world, the night I discovered that my husband, Samuel, had betrayed me. A single night, a single reckless moment that unraveled years of trust and love like a loose thread in a carefully woven tapestry. The memory of it still felt like a Shea RP pinprick in my heart, a constant reminder of the fragility of the life I thought was so secure. I had married Samuel with the kind of hopeful love that comes with youth, believing in the promises made under the canopy of a clear blue sky. We had met during our junior year of college, back when everything seemed possible and the world was wide open. Samuel was charming, the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of anything. He was tall, with dark hair that always seemed to fall just right, and a confident smile that made you feel like the most important person in the room. I was drawn to him like a moth to a flame, captivated by his energy, his ambition, his laughter. But now, looking back, I wondered if I had seen only what I wanted to see. The signs had been there, I suppose, scattered like breadcrumbs. Little things that didn't quite add up, moments when I had felt a twinge of doubt, but had brushed it aside, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Samuel was a busy man with a demanding job, traveling frequently for business. I had always trusted him, never questioning the late nights or the business dinners that stretched into the early hours of the morning. The night I found out about the bet was meant to be a celebration. Samuel had landed a significant contract with a new client, and we had planned a small gathering at our home. Our closest friends were there: Anna and her husband, Tom, Michael, who had been my confidant since college, and Laura, a new friend who had recently moved into our neighborhood. The laughter and clinking of glasses filled the air, masking the undercurrent of tension I was too blind to see. It was during that party, amidst the congratulatory toasts and shared stories, that I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I had gone upstairs to fetch a bottle of wine from our bedroom, needing a moment of quiet away from the noise. As I approached the door, I heard Samuel's voice, low and conspiratorial, followed by a shuck kill that made my blood run cold. "Honestly, it started as a stupid bet," he was saying, the words tumbling out with a careless ease that belied their gravity. "But then it just got out of hand. I never thought it would go this far." There was a pause, and I heard Tom's voice, half laughing, half serious. "You mean to tell me you actually married her because of it?" "Yeah," Samuel replied, unashamed. "It was supposed to be a joke, a way to prove a point. But then, well, you know how it is. Things just happened." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, my breath catching in my throat. I leaned against the wall, struggling to process the words. A bet. Our marriage, the life we had built together, all of it born from a thoughtless gamble. I wanted to burst into the room, demand answers, scream at him for his betrayal. But instead, I found myself frozen, unable to move or speak, my mind reeling from the revelation. Eventually, I forced myself to rejoin the party, pasting on a smile that felt brittle and false. I moved through the rest of the evening in a daze, barely hearing the conversations around me. My eyes kept drifting to Samuel, who was the picture of the perfect host, laughing and charming our guests as if nothing had changed. In the days that followed, I tried to confront him, to find the courage to ask if what I had heard was true. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. I was terrified of the confirmation, of hearing him say those words again, this time to my face. Instead, I focused on the mundane tasks of daily life, hoping that routine would provide some semblance of normalcy. It was Michael who finally gave me the push I needed. We were having coffee at our favorite cafe, a cozy little place with mismatched furniture and the best pastries in town. Michael had been my rock since college, a steady presence through exams, heartbreaks, and career changes. He was perceptive, with a knack for seeing, through my attempts to hide the truth. "You've been quiet," he observed, studying me over the rim of his cup. "Something's wrong." I hesitated, my fingers tracing the handle of my mug. "It's Samuel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard him say something the other night. Something unforgivable." Michael's expression darkened, concern etched into his features. "What did he say?" Taking a deep breath, I recounted the conversation I'd overheard, each word tasting like ashes on my tongue. Michael listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "That bastard," he said finally, his voice laced with anger. "I always thought there was something off about him." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, a hint of accusation creeping into my tone. "I didn't have proof," Michael replied, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't want to plant doubts in your head without reason, but now that you know, you have to do something." His words echoed in my mind long after. We parted ways, a constant reminder that I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I had to confront Samuel, to face the reality of what our marriage had become. That evening, I waited for him to come home, my heart pounding in my chest. When he finally walked through the door, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines of stress etched into his face. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the betrayal, the lies, and the sympathy evaporated like mist. "Samuel," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "we need to talk." He looked at me, surprise flickering across his features, and then nodded. "Sure, what's up?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "I know about the bet. I heard you talking to Tom." His reaction was immediate, a flash of panic crossing his face before he schooled his features into a mask of calm. "It's not what you think," he began, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said sharply, my anger finally breaking free. "I heard you, Samuel. I heard everything. Our marriage, all of it, because of a stupid bet. How could you?" He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. For a long moment we stood there, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice weary and resigned. "I'm sorry," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It was a mistake. A stupid, careless mistake. I never meant for it to go this far." His apology did little to soothe the hurt, the betrayal that festered like an open wound. But it was a start, a crack in the wall of lies that had surrounded us. As I looked at him, I realized that this was just the beginning. There were still so many questions, so many truths that needed to be unearthed. I didn't know what the future held, whether our marriage could survive the damage that had been done. But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let this betrayal define me. I would find a way to rebuild, to reclaim my life and my happiness, no matter what it took. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floral patterns on the carpet beneath my feet. It was a pattern I had memorized over the years, a pattern that now seemed to mock the predictability of my life, or what I thought was my life. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each tick a reminder of time lost and promises broken. It had been 2 weeks since I found out about the bet. 2 weeks since my world turned upside down. My husband, Kenneth, the man I had trusted with my heart, had shattered it for a mere wager. I still vividly remembered the moment I overheard the conversation between him and his friends. They laughed, clinking glasses, as Kenneth boasted about how he had won the bet by marrying me. I was nothing more than a pawn in their game, and the realization cut deeper than any betrayal I had ever imagined. I had confronted him, of course, asked him why. His response was a mixture of shame and defiance. He admitted it was true, but insisted that he had grown to love me over the years. The words felt hollow, as if they were recited from a script. In that moment, I saw Kenneth for who he really was, a man who valued the thrill of a gamble over the sanctity of a promise. The days that followed were a blur of tears and anger. It was a tempest of emotions that I couldn't contain. I found myself questioning everything, every moment, every gesture, every word he had ever spoken to me. Was it all a lie? Had there ever been love? Or was it all just an elaborate performance? I felt trapped in a life I no longer recognized. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I needed to get out, to breathe, to find my footing in a world that had shifted beneath me. So I packed a small bag and drove to my sister's house, seeking refuge in a place where I could be myself without judgment. My sister Anne was a pillar of strength. Older by 5 years, she had always been the one I turned to in times of crisis. Her home was cozy, filled with the warmth of family and the chaos of children. It was exactly what I needed, a reminder that life went on, even amidst turmoil. Anne welcomed me with open arms, her intuition immediately sensing the depth of my despair. She didn't press for details, knowing I would open up when I was ready. Instead, she offered comfort in the form of hot tea and understanding silence. As I settled into the guest room, I began to reflect on my life, on the choices that had led me here. I thought about the early days of my marriage, the hope and excitement that had filled those first few years. Kenneth and I had met at a charity gala, an event neither of us had wanted to attend. Yet there was an instant connection, a spark that seemed too real to be anything but genuine. It was a whirlwind romance, and we married within a year. Now, I wondered if that spark had been nothing more than the flicker of his deceit. Days turned D into a week, and slowly I allowed myself to lower the walls I had built around my heart. Anne's children were a welcome distraction, their laughter and innocence a balm to my wounded spirit. I found solace in the routine of their lives, in the mundane tasks that filled the day. It was during one of these moments, as I watched Anne's youngest, Lily, play in the garden, that I realized I needed to make a decision. I couldn't remain in limbo forever, caught between the past and an uncertain future. I needed to confront Kenneth, to decide whether our marriage was worth saving or if it was time to walk away. With a newfound resolve, I returned home. The drive back was long, giving me ample time to prepare for the confrontation ahead. I rehearsed what I would say, trying to anticipate his responses, to steel myself against the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. When I entered the house, Kenneth was sitting in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand. He looked up as I walked in, surprise flitting across his features. There was a moment of silence, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. Kenneth nodded, setting his glass down. "I've been waiting for you to come back," he replied, his tone earnest, as if waiting would somehow absolve him of his sins. I sat across from him, the coffee table a barrier between us. "I need to know why, Kenneth. Why would you do this?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing, but now seemed rehearsed. "It was a stupid mistake, a moment of weakness. I never meant for it to go this far." "That's not good enough," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I need to understand how you could betray me like that. Was any of it real?" Kenneth leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Yes, it was real. It is real. I know it started as a bet, but I fell in love with you, genuinely. I didn't know how to tell you, how to confess without losing you." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I wanted to believe him. But the wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. "I need time," I said finally, standing up. "Time to think, to decide what I want." Kenneth nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I understand. I'll give you space, whatever you need." As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I had taken the first step towards reclaiming my life, and sadness for the love that had been tainted by lies. The days that followed were filled with introspection and difficult conversations with myself. I sought advice from friends and family, each offering their own perspective, but ultimately, I knew the decision was mine alone. It was during this period of reflection that I met Richard. It was an unexpected encounter, one that would change the course of my life in ways I couldn't have foreseen. Richard was a billionaire, a man of means and influence, yet he was also surprisingly down to earth. We met through a mutual friend at a fundraiser, a chance meeting that felt anything but accidental. Richard was charming in a way that was genuine, his interest in me apparent yet respectful. As we talked, I found myself drawn to his intelligence and warmth, qualities that reminded me of what I had once loved about Kenneth. But Richard was different. There was a sincerity to his words, a depth to his character that intrigued me. As our friendship blossomed, I found myself opening up to him about my situation. Richard listened without judgment, offering support and understanding. He didn't push for more than I was ready to give, and that patience endeared him to me even more. In Richard, I found a confidant, someone who saw me not just as a woman scorned, but as a person deserving of love and respect. It was a revelation that helped me see my worth beyond the confines of my marriage. Yet, even as my feelings for Richard grew, I knew I needed to resolve the situation with Kenneth. I couldn't move forward with my life until I had laid the past to rest. And so, with a heavy heart, I arranged to meet Kenneth once more, determined to finally make a choice. The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon, a neutral location where we could speak openly without the shadows of our shared history looming over us. As I sat across from Kenneth, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I was ready to face whatever came next. "I've thought a lot about us," I began, choosing my words carefully, "about what happened and where we go from here." Kenneth nodded, his expression somber. "And what have you decided?" I've decided that I can't continue living a lie, I replied, my voice steady. I need to move on, to find happiness and trust again, and I can't do that with you. He looked away, the weight of my words settling heavily between us. I understand, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I could change the past, but I can't. I just hope you find what you're looking for. As we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure that had eluded me for so long. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, and as I left, I couldn't help but think of Richard, of the possibilities that lay ahead. In the wake of betrayal, I had found strength, and in that strength, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. As the rain tapped against the window, I sank into the worn armchair by the fireplace, the crackling flames offering little warmth against the chill that had settled deep within my bones. It had been months since that fateful night when my world, once filled with predictable routines and the comforting hum of daily life, came crashing down like a house of cards. I remember the evening vividly. It was a Thursday, the day of the week that had become synonymous with the comforting routine of dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant. Tom and I had celebrated countless anniversaries, birthdays, and spontaneous moments of joy there. The staff knew us by name, and we had our usual table by the window, overlooking the bustling street below. I had dressed carefully that night, selecting a navy dress that Tom had once said brought out the color of my eyes. I wanted everything to be perfect, a small gesture to reignite a spark that had seemed to fade over the years. But as the night unfolded, I noticed Tom was distant, his eyes flickering over his phone more often than they met mine. A smile, once warm and familiar, now seemed rehearsed, a shadow of its former self. I tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach, attributing his distraction to work stress, or perhaps a lingering hangover from the previous night's poker game with his friends. But as the dinner wore on, the sense of unease became impossible to ignore. Later, at home, I found myself absent-mindedly tidying up the living room, picking up discarded clothes and empty glasses, remnants of a life that had grown increasingly solitary. It was then that I stumbled upon the crumpled piece of paper wedged between the couch cushions. The words, scrawled in Tom's familiar handwriting, sent a chill through my spine. Bet $10,000. She'll never find out. The realization hit me like a freight train, each word burning a hole through my heart. Betrayal, one of the few things I had always believed to be beyond Tom's capability, was sprawled before me, undeniable and stark. I felt the room close in around me, the walls pressing tighter as if conspiring to suffocate the truth. For a moment, I stood frozen, the paper trembling in my hands, my mind racing through 1,000 possibilities, each more painful than the last. I confronted him that night, my voice surprisingly steady as I laid the evidence before him. There was a moment of silence, a suspended breath where I hoped, desperately, that he would deny it, laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But he didn't. Instead, Tom simply looked at me, the mask of indifference slipping to reveal an unfamiliar coldness in his eyes. "It was just a joke, Lisa," he said, his voice devoid of any remorse. "A bet with the guys. It doesn't mean anything." Those words, meant to diffuse the situation, only served to ignite a fire within me. A joke. A bet. Was that all our marriage had become? A mere game to be wagered over a poker table? I felt a surge of anger, raw and unfiltered, rising like a tidal wave. But beneath the anger lay a deeper, more insidious emotion. Doubt. Not just about Tom, but about myself and the life we had built together. Had I been blind, blissfully ignorant of the cracks that had been forming beneath the surface? In the days that followed, I found myself sifting through the rubble of our life together, each memory tainted by the shadow of betrayal. I replayed conversations, scrutinized his actions, searching for signs I had missed. A glance too long, a night out that stretched too late, the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes. It was as if I had been handed a new lens through which to view my past, and every moment seemed to warp under its harsh glare. Friends and family, those who had been fixtures in our lives, offered support, their words a mix of comfort and curiosity. Some were shocked, others claimed they had seen it coming, their hindsight conveniently clear. My sister Beth, always the pragmatic one, urged me to consider my options, her voice a steady anchor in the storm that had become my life. "You need to think about yourself, Lisa," she insisted over coffee one afternoon, her eyes searching mine for some sign of resolve. "You deserve better than this." Deserve. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. What did I deserve? A question that had never seemed so pertinent, so loaded with the weight of unspoken dreams and suppressed desires. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed distant, I found myself questioning everything. My choices, my sacrifices, the life I had chosen to lead. It was during one of these introspective evenings that I met him. A chance encounter, seemingly insignificant at the time, but one that would alter the course of my life in ways I could never have imagined. Philip, a name that would soon become synonymous with change and possibility. We met at a charity gala, one of those obligatory events that had always felt more like a chore than an evening of enjoyment. I had almost canceled, the thought of small talk and forced smiles too exhausting to bear. But Beth had insisted, her persistent encouragement a gentle nudge towards normalcy. Philip was introduced to me by a mutual acquaintance, a man whose name I quickly forgot in the whirlwind of introductions. He was quiet, his presence commanding without being overbearing, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of social climbers and networking enthusiasts that filled the room. We exchanged pleasantries, the usual questions about work and family, but there was something in his demeanor, a genuine interest that set him apart. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves gravitating towards each other, the conversation flowing easily, as if we had known each other for years. He listened, truly listened, as I spoke about my work in education, my passion for teaching, and the challenges that came with it. In return, he shared stories of his own, a world of business and philanthropy that seemed both foreign and fascinating. As the night drew to a close, Philip offered to walk me to my car, a gentlemanly gesture that felt oddly comforting. We stood by my car for a moment, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the ballroom. "I hope we can meet again," he said, his voice low and sincere. There was no pressure in his words, just an open invitation, an offering of friendship that felt both unexpected and welcome. As I drove home that night, I found myself replaying our conversation, each word and gesture taking on new significance. It was as if Philip had opened a door to a world I had long forgotten, one where possibility and hope still existed, untarnished by betrayal and doubt. In the weeks that followed, Philip and I met several times, each encounter a balm to my wounded soul. He was a patient listener, never pressing for details I wasn't ready to share, his presence a steady reminder that life could be more than the sum of its disappointments. Slowly, the pieces of my shattered life began to realign, forming a picture that was both unfamiliar and exciting. Tom's betrayal, once the defining moment of my existence, began to fade into the background, a painful lesson rather than a permanent scar. But as I started to rebuild, to rediscover who I was beyond the confines of my marriage, a new challenge emerged, one that would test the very foundations of my newfound independence. Philip's world, vast and complex, was not without its own shadows, and as I stepped further into it, I realized that the path to healing was not as straightforward as I had hoped. The truth, I learned, is rarely simple, and as I navigated the intricacies of love, loyalty, and trust, I discovered that the line between right and wrong, just like the line between love and betrayal, was often blurred beyond recognition. The first time I began to suspect something was amiss, it was a quiet Tuesday evening in late September. The leaves outside our suburban home had started their gradual transformation, their edges tinged with gold and crimson, a beautiful facade for the decay that lay beneath. I was folding laundry in the dim light of the living room, a mundane task I found oddly comforting. My husband, Richard, called Rick by everyone but me, was late coming home again. It wasn't unusual. His job often demanded long hours, or so he claimed. Yet, a peculiar gnawing feeling had settled in my chest, persistent as a toothache, telling me not everything was as it seemed. Rick worked in finance, a world of numbers and negotiations, one I never fool-lie understood but respected from a distance. He was ambitious, always had been, And I admired that about him. His drive had been one of the many qualities that drew me to him in the first place. We met in college, both young and brimming with dreams that felt as tangible as the autumn air. I had been studying literature, lost in a world of words and stories, while he navigated the more pragmatic landscape of business. Our paths crossed in a small cafe just off campus, the kind of place where students linger over lukewarm coffee and aspire to change the world. He was charming, with an easy smile and a confidence that seemed unshakable. It was easy to fall in love with him. His laughter was infectious, and he had a way of making me feel seen, truly seen, in a way no one else ever had. We married young, buoyed by the belief that our love could weather any storm. But as I folded the last pair of his socks that evening, I was beginning to feel the first cold fingers of doubt. I was startled from my thoughts by the sound of the front door opening. Rick walked in, his tie slightly askew, a tired smile playing on his lips. "Hey, sorry I'm late," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. I forced a smile, swallowing the unease that threatened to choke me. "Long day?" "You could say that." He shrugged out of his jacket and slumped onto the couch beside me, pulling me into a familiar embrace. His warmth should have been reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential between us had shifted. We sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. I wanted to ask him about his day, to bridge the gap that had somehow formed between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I focused on the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, trying to match my breaths to his, as if synchronizing our breathing could somehow synchronize our hearts. The following weeks passed in a blur of routine and monotony. Rick's absences became more frequent, high-S excuses more varied. I told myself it was just a busy season at work, that he would soon return to the man I had married, but the doubt persisted. Each time I broached the subject, he brushed it off with a reassuring smile and a quick kiss, as if that could obliterate the chasm growing between us. It wasn't until I met Claire, a woman from my book club, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Claire was vivacious, with a sharp wit and an uncanny ability to read people. She was the kind of woman who could coax secrets from the most guarded of souls, and over coffee one afternoon, she turned her perceptive gaze on me. "You're not yourself lately," she observed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Is everything okay with you and Rick?" I hesitated, the instinct to protect our marriage warring with my need for solace. Claire was persistent, though, and with her gentle prodding, the words spilled out before I could stop them. I told her about Rick's late nights, his changing behavior, and the growing distance between us. Claire listened intently, nodding at the right moments, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know, sometimes men like Rick get caught up in their own ambitions," she said carefully. "Sometimes they forget what's truly important." Her words struck a chord, and for a brief moment, I considered dismissing her concerns. But deep down, I knew she was right. I had seen the change in Rick, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his work, as if it were the only thing that mattered. It wasn't long after that conversation that I stumbled upon the truth. I had been tidying up Rick's home office, a room I rarely ventured into, when I found it. A crumpled piece of paper half hidden beneath a stack of financial reports. It was a note, scrawled in Rick's unmistakable handwriting, but the words were like a punch to the gut. "Bet with Mark. Prove she won't leave." I felt the world tilt beneath me, the ground shifting in a sickening lurch. A bet? My marriage, my life, my love, reduced to a wager? I sank onto the plush office chair, the note clutched in my trembling hand. It felt as though the air had been sucked from the room, leaving me gasping in disbelief. I spent the next few hours in a haze, the revelation replaying in my mind like a broken record. How could he? How could he reduce everything we had, everything we were, to a game? Anger simmered beneath the surface, battling with the profound hurt that threatened to consume me. That evening, I confronted Rick. He looked up from his laptop, surprise flickering across his features as I stood before him, the note clutched in my fist. "What is this, Rick?" My voice was steady, but I could feel the tremor in my hands. He glanced at the note, his expression shifting from confusion to something unreadable. It's not what it looks like, he began, but I cut him off, the dam of my restraint finally breaking. Not what it looks like, K.E.? I echoed, my voice rising. Then what is it? Because it looks like you made a bet about our marriage, about me. Rick stood, reaching for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. It's complicated, he said, his tone pleading. You have to understand, I never meant for it to go this far. His words only fanned the flames of my anger. Understand? What am I supposed to understand, Rick? That I was just some kind of challenge to you? A game? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched into every line of his face. It started as a stupid thing, a joke. I never thought it would turn into this. A joke, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Our life together was a joke to you? He shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. No, of course not. I love you, I do. It was just a stupid mistake. The sincerity in his eyes gave me pause, but the betrayal was too deep, too raw. I turned away, unable to bear the sight of him, and fled to the sanctuary of our bedroom. In the solitude of that room, I allowed myself to break. The tears came in a torrent, years of love and trust cascading down my cheeks. I thought of the woman I had been, the woman who had believed in happy endings and forever promises. That woman felt like a stranger now, her dreams crushed beneath the weight of betrayal. But even in the depths of my despair, a small voice whispered of resilience. I was not defined by his actions, and I refused to let his betrayal destroy me. There was a strength within me, forged in the fires of heartbreak, and I would rise from this, even if I had to do it alone. The path ahead was uncertain, and the journey would be fraught with challenges, but I would face them one step at a time. I had to believe that there was a future beyond this, a future where I could reclaim my life and perhaps, one day, find peace. I sat alone at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the delicate floral pattern of the china teacup. The sunlight filtering through the lace curtains painted a soft glow across the room, but my heart felt leaden, far removed from the warmth of the morning. The world around me continued its relentless churn, oblivious to the chaos that had uprooted the foundations of my life. It was 3 months since I had discovered the truth, a truth so raw that it still felt like a fresh wound. Tom, my husband, the man I had trusted implicitly, had shattered the illusion of our life together. I had stumbled upon the secret while cleaning out the study, a room he often retreated to late at night. Among the piles of paperwork and forgotten bills, I found a letter, tucked away inside an old, dusty book. The letter was crude in its simplicity, yet devastating in its content. A note from one of his friends, congratulating him on winning the bet. It was a bet that revolved around a cruel joke, the punchline being my unwitting role in their adolescent game. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Every smile, every tender moment, every whispered promise, now tainted by the knowledge that they had been orchestrated, part of a scheme to win a bet. In that moment, the life I thought I knew dissolved into a mirage of deceit. I had always been a practical woman, rooted in the reality of everyday life. My days were filled with managing our home, volunteering at the local library, and attending community events. But this revelation left me adrift, questioning my every decision, my sense of self, my very identity. I was no longer sure which parts of my life were genuine and which were mere constructs built on lies. As I sat there, the tea growing cold, I heard the familiar creak of the front door. Tom was home early, his presence instantly filling the air with an unspoken tension. Our exchanges had become strained, filled with a formality that belied our years together. He entered the kitchen, his face a mask of feigned normalcy. "Hey, Anna," he greeted, his voice overly cheerful, as if trying to erase the distance that had grown between us. I nodded in acknowledgement, not trusting myself to speak without the dam of emotions breaking free. I watched him move around the kitchen, his actions deliberate, as though he were navigating a minefield. We had become strangers inhabiting the same space, bound by shared history, but severed by the truth. "I thought maybe we could go out for dinner tonight," he suggested tentatively, breaking the silence. The idea of sitting across from him, Pretending that everything was as it once was filled me with dread. Yet, there was a part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, that longed for some semblance of normalcy, a tiny thread to hold on to in the unraveling tapestry of my life. "All right," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We spent the afternoon in separate worlds, each absorbed in our own thoughts. I busied myself with mindless tasks, cleaning rooms that were already spotless, arranging and rearranging the furniture. Anything to avoid confronting the inevitable, to stave off the growing sense of betrayal. As evening fell, I dressed for dinner, choosing a simple black dress that had always been Tom's favorite. It felt like a costume, a facade I wore to maintain the illusion of our marriage, if only for a few more hours. We drove to a quaint little restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place we had frequented in happier times. The familiarity of it was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what once was. Throughout the meal, we danced around topics, discussing everything and nothing. The weather, the latest news, trivial matters that filled the space between us, but did nothing to bridge the growing chasm. I watched him carefully, searching for any hint of remorse, any sign that the man I married was still in there somewhere. "Anna," he finally said, breaking the brittle surface of our conversation. "No, things have been difficult, since everything." His words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken. Difficulty was an understatement, a word too mild to encapsulate the turmoil that had ensued. But I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I never meant for things to get this way," he confessed, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "It started as a stupid bet, a joke that went too far, but I never imagined it would end like this." I listened, my heart a tumult of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, all warring with the remnants of love and the memories of the life we had built together. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers that might never come. But instead, I sat there in silence, letting his words wash over me. "Do you love me, Tom?" I asked quietly, the question lingering between us like a fragile thread. He hesitated, a pause so brief that it might have gone unnoticed, yet long enough to confirm my worst fears. His response, when it finally came, was a whisper. I do. But it's complicated, Anna." Complicated. Another word that failed to capture the complexity of our situation, the tangled web of emotions and choices that had led us here. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and forced a small smile, one that felt foreign on my lips. As we left the restaurant, the cool evening air enveloped us, a stark contrast to the warmth of the dinner. We walked side by side, our hands brushing occasionally, each touch a reminder of the intimacy that once existed. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts, the weight of the unspoken filling the car. Back at the house, I lingered in the hallway, watching Tom move about the living room, his actions mechanical, as if he were going through the motions of a life that no longer felt real. I retreated to our bedroom, the familiar space now a landscape of memories, both cherished and painful. I lay awake that night, listening to the rhythmic sound of Tom's breathing beside me. I thought of the life we had shared, the dreams we had nurtured, the future we had envisioned, and I wondered if it was possible to rebuild from the rubble, to forge a new path from the ashes of betrayal. But in the quiet darkness, another thought began to take shape, an unexpected glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Perhaps this was not the end, but a beginning, a chance to rediscover myself, to reclaim the fragments of my life that had been lost along the way. And with that thought, I felt a flicker of determination, a resolve to find a way forward, one step at a time. As dawn broke and light filled the room, I knew that the journey would be long and fraught with challenges. But I also knew that I was not alone. For somewhere in the tangled mess of emotions and decisions, I was still me, Anna, and that was a beginning in itself. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow on the familiar room that had become my sanctuary and prison, all at once. It's funny how the familiar can be comforting and suffocating simultaneously. I sat on the edge of the bed, my feet touching the cool wooden floor, grounding me in the reality I was reluctantly accepting. It had been 2 months since the night my world shattered, the night I discovered the insidious truth about Mark. It was a revelation that left me reeling, like a punch to the gut that knocked the air from my lungs. I was still struggling to breathe normally, trying to make sense of the fragments of my life that lay scattered around me. Mark and I had been married for 25 years, a milestone I once believed was an indication of our unwavering bond. We met in college, where he was the charismatic, ambitious man every girl wanted, and I was the shy, bookish girl who somehow caught his eye. Our lives were woven together with dreams and promises, the kind of love story that seemed perfect from the outside looking in. But one evening, while clearing out the attic, I found a crumpled piece of paper tucked away behind old photo albums. It was a letter, a relic of our past that should have been sweetly nostalgic, but instead became a weapon of betrayal. It was from an old college friend, Eric, one I hadn't thought about in years. The letter was dated shortly after Mark and I had begun dating. It casually recounted a bet, a thoughtless, callous bet, that Mark could make me fall in love with him within a month. The prize was a mere $50, an inconsequential sum that now felt like the price of my dignity. I stared at the letter, my mind refusing to process the words. How could something that seemed so real, so profound, be born out of such triviality? I confronted Mark that night, the letter clutched in my trembling hand. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to. Instead, he sat silently, his expression unreadable, as if the man I'd known for decades had become a stranger overnight. "I was young, stupid," he said finally, his voice devoid of the warmth I once found reassuring. "But it was a long time ago, and it doesn't change what we have now." His words felt hollow, inadequate. How could he dismiss the foundation of our life as a momentary lapse of judgment? The betrayal didn't end with the bet. It lingered in the years that followed, in every argument and every tender moment that now seemed tainted by his initial deception. The days after were a blur of anger and confusion. I found myself questioning everything, every whispered promise, every shared dream. Was it all a lie? Had our life been a carefully constructed facade? I couldn't bear to look at Mark, yet his presence was unavoidable, a constant reminder of the pain he'd inflicted. One morning, as I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, I decided I couldn't continue living in this limbo. I needed clarity, a chance to understand, and perhaps salvage what remained of my self-respect. I called Lily, my childhood friend and confidant, whose pragmatic approach to life was something I desperately needed. When she arrived, her embrace was a balm to my frayed nerves. Over the years, Lily had been my anchor, the one person who knew me better than I knew myself. She listened as I recounted the events, her eyes widening with disbelief and a hint of anger on my behalf. "That bastard!" she spat, her hands gripping mine tightly. "How dare he do this to you?" Her outrage was a comfort, a validation of my own feelings. For hours we talked, dissecting every aspect of my marriage, trying to find meaning in the chaos. Lily reminded me of my strength, of the resilience I seemed to have forgotten in the midst of my heartache. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. The cracks remained, both in my marriage and my self-image. Yet, with Lily's unwavering support and my own determination, I started to see beyond the betrayal. I began to understand that my life wasn't defined by Mark's actions. I had value, purpose, and a future that was mine to shape. Then, unexpectedly, life threw me another curveball. It came in the form of an invitation to a charity gala, one of the many events Mark and I used to attend. I was hesitant to go, uncertain if I was ready to face the world with my newfound understanding. But Lily insisted, arguing that it was time for me to reclaim my life. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, selecting a dress that made me feel confident and unapologetically myself. As I entered the grand ballroom, the familiar buzz of conversations and clinking glasses enveloped me. It was both daunting and exhilarating to be in the midst of such a gathering. It was there, amid the laughter and clamor, that I met Henry. He was nothing like Mark, older, with a quiet demeanor and an aura of genuine kindness. We were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and our conversation flowed effortlessly, a balm to my wounded spirit. Henry listened intently as I spoke, his interest in my words genuine and unforced. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn to him, his presence a comforting contrast to the turmoil I'd endured. Henry was a successful businessman, a billionaire in his own right, yet there was a humility about him, a sense of groundedness that belied his wealth. Our friendship blossomed, and with it, I began to heal. Henry never pried into my past, never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he offered companionship, a quiet support that allowed me to rediscover myself. I was cautious, wary of opening my heart again, but with Henry, it felt different, safe. One rainy afternoon, as we sat in a small cafe, Henry reached for my hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You deserve to be happy, to be loved for who you are," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. His words lingered with me long after we parted, echoing in my mind as I considered the path my life had taken. I had been betrayed, yes, but I was not broken. I had found strength in my vulnerability, courage in my pain, and perhaps, just perhaps, I was ready to embrace the possibility of love once more. As I stood by the window that evening, watching the rain trail down the glass, I realized that my journey was far from over. There would be challenges and uncertainties, decisions to be made, and paths to be chosen. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that the future held promise and the potential for happiness, no matter how unexpected the road to it might be. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that whispered promises of change as the leaves fluttered to the ground in vibrant hues of orange and gold. I remember standing on the porch of our modest suburban home, the cool breeze kissing my cheeks as I watched the world drift by in a gentle blur. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and my heart felt heavy with the weight of secrets I was yet to uncover. My husband, Mark, had left early that morning with a hurried kiss on the cheek and a mumbled excuse about an urgent meeting. I had grown accustomed to these hurried departures and late-night returns, convincing myself they were the demands of his job at the law firm. Still, a nagging doubt had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach, a whisper of intuition that something was amiss. Our marriage had begun with the kind of love story that seemed to leap from the pages of a well-read novel. We were young, hopeful, sharing dreams over candlelit dinners and believing in the promise of forever. But as the years passed, the warmth of our initial passion cooled into a routine, and our conversations dwindled to discussions about bills and schedules. As I stood there, I was jolted from my thoughts by the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Ruth, my neighbor and closest confidant, her kind eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. Ruth was a woman of few words, but her silences spoke volumes. She had lived a life full of trials, raising 3 children on her own, after her husband left her for another woman. Her strength and resilience never failed to inspire me. "Morning, Lucy," she greeted, her voice as warm as the tea she often brewed for us during our afternoon chats. "Morning, Ruth," I replied, managing a smile that I hoped masked the unease brewing within me. "How's everything?" "Can't complain," she said, leaning against the porch railing with a sigh. "Kids are all doing well. Matt finally landed that job he was hoping for, but enough about me. How are you holding up?" The question, though simple, struck a chord. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Oh, you know, just the usual. Mark's been busy with work, so it's been a lot of me time lately." Ruth nodded, her eyes searching mine. "You know you can always talk to me, right? Sometimes sharing helps." I nodded, grateful for her presence. "I know, Ruth. Thank you." As she departed, leaving me with my swirling thoughts, I resolved to push aside my doubts. Perhaps I was overthinking, reading too much into the changes in Mark's behavior. Maybe he was just stressed, and we needed to find our way back to each other again. But as the day wore on, I found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing chasm between us. That evening, as I prepared dinner, the silence in the house felt oppressive. I busied myself with chopping vegetables, the rhythmic motion a welcome distraction from the turmoil within. Mark returned home later than usual, his face drawn and tired. He offered a quick apology for his tardiness, citing an overload of casework, I accepted it without question, serving the meal and attempting to engage him in conversation. But his responses were clipped, his mind clearly elsewhere. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between us only seemed to widen. Mark's absences became more frequent, and the excuses less convincing. I began to notice other things too: whispered phone calls in another room, a reluctance to meet my gaze, and a lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything changed. I had decided to clean out the attic, hoping to distract myself from the gnawing anxiety. As I rummaged through old boxes, I stumbled upon a stack of letters, their faded envelopes tied together with a fraying ribbon. Curiosity piqued, I untied the bundle and began to read. The letters were from Mark's college days, written in a handwriting I barely recognized as his own. They detailed a bet, a cruel, thoughtless wager made with his friends about who could woo the plain, unsuspecting girl in their class. A girl who, unbeknownst to them, would later become his wife. My hands shook as I read the words, each sentence a dagger to my heart. Betrayal washed over me in waves, and I struggled to comprehend the depth of his deceit. This was the man I had devoted my life to, the one I had trusted implicitly. And yet, our entire relationship had been built on a lie. I confronted Mark that evening, the letters clenched tightly in my fist. His initial denial quickly crumbled under the weight of evidence, and he admitted to the bet with a shamefaced confess ion. His apologies were numerous, but they felt hollow, as though they could never fill the gaping void his betrayal had left behind. Days turned into weeks as I grappled with my emotions, vacillating between anger and heartbreak. Ruth became my anchor, her presence a balm during the storm of my unraveling marriage. She listened without judgment, offering me a shoulder to cry on and a quiet strength that helped me find my own. Meanwhile, Mark seemed to change overnight, desperate to make amends. He showered me with affection and promises of change, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our love had been irrevocably tainted. The trust, once so absolute, was now a fragile thing, easily shattered by the slightest doubt. It was during this tumultuous time that I met David. David was everything Mark was not: calm, confident, and genuine. We crossed paths at a charity event organized by Ruth, where he was one of the keynote speakers. His words resonated with me, and when we spoke afterward, I found myself drawn to his sincerity. David was a self-made man, having built a successful business from the ground up. His wealth was evident, but it was his humility and compassion that truly set him apart. We began to meet occasionally, our conversations a welcome escape from the chaos at home. As I spent more time with David, I began to see my life from a new perspective. I realized I had been living in the shadow of Mark's betrayal for far too long, allowing it to define me. With David's support, I slowly started to reclaim my sense of self-worth, rediscovering the woman I had been before my world was turned upside down. Despite my growing feelings for David, I was hesitant to act on them. I was still married, after all, and the idea of stepping into another relationship felt daunting. But David, ever patient, assured me that he was willing to wait, that he understood the complexities of my situation. In the end, it was Mark's actions that pushed me to make a decision. One night, after a particularly heated argument, he stormed out of the house, leaving behind a trail of broken promises. As I sat alone in the silence, I realized that I could no longer continue living in the shadow of his betrayal. I filed for divorce the following week, a decision that was both terrifying and liberating. Mark was initially resistant, but eventually, he accepted the inevitability of our separation. It was a painful process, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but I knew it was the only way forward. Through it all, David remained by my side, a steady presence in the midst of chaos. His unwavering support gave me the strength to rebuild my life, piece by piece. And as the dust settled, I found that I was no longer defined by Mark's betrayal, but by my own resilience and capacity for growth. In time, David and I grew closer, our friendship blossoming into something deeper. His love was a balm for my wounded heart, and with him, I found a happiness I had thought lost forever. Our relationship, though born from the ashes of my past, became a testament to the power of healing and new beginnings. As the leaves began to fall once more, I stood on the porch of my new home, watching the world drift by in a gentle blur. The air was crisp and full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I had walked through the fire and emerged stronger, ready to embrace whatever the future held. And as David joined me, his hand slipping comfortably into mine, I knew that I had found not just a partner, but a true companion. Together, we faced the world, our hearts open to the possibilities of tomorrow. I had never been one to believe in fairy tales, but on the day of my wedding, as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lace veil that cascaded down my back, I allowed myself a moment of fantasy. The gown fit like it had been made for me, each delicate stitch a promise of the future I thought awaited me. I glanced at the reflection of my mother, who sat in the corner of the room, her eyes moist with pride. She was my steady rock, always there, even when the storms of life threatened to sweep me away. As I walked down the aisle towards Michael, my heart swelled with a mixture of love and nervous anticipation. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I believed that everything we had gone through had been worth it. But beneath the surface of that perfect day, there lurked a truth I was not yet ready to confront. The first few months of marriage felt like a continuation of our courtship, a collection of shared dreams, late-night conversations, and laughter that echoed through the small apartment we called home. But as the seasons changed, so did the tone of our life together. Subtle shifts in Michael's demeanor began to unsettle me. He started coming home late, his excuses flimsy and unconvincing. There were hushed phone calls he took in the other room, and nights when he seemed distant, lost in a world I wasn't a part of. I tried to dismiss my worries as irrational, echoes of past insecurities that had no place in this new chapter of my life. Yet the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they grew slowly, wrapping tendrils around my heart. It was during one of those restless nights, as I lay awake listening to the rhythmic sound of Michael's breathing, that I decided to confront him about my fears. The conversation that followed was not the cathartic release I had hoped for. Instead, it left me more confused, his reassurances feeling hollow, like echoes bouncing off the walls of a cavern. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the tension between us became palpable. I watched him, searching his face for clues, for the man I had fallen in love with. But it was a stranger who sat before me, his eyes shadowed and evasive. "Michael, we need to talk," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. He looked up from his plate, his fork paused in midair. "About what?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Us. This distance between us. I feel like you're keeping something from me," I said, my heart pounding with each word. For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond me. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "It's nothing, really. Just work stress. You know how it is," he said. But there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed him. I wanted to believe him, to take his words and wrap them around me like a shield against the storm gathering on the horizon. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than he was willing to admit. Days turned into weeks, and the unease between us grew. I found myself questioning everything, each phone call he took, every text message that made his phone buzz. It was during one of those moments of doubt that I stumbled upon the truth. Though it took the form of a revelation so unexpected, it left me reeling. I was tidying up our small living room when I found the note, a crumpled piece of paper tucked between the cushions of the couch. At first, I thought it was a grocery list or a reminder scrawled in haste. But as I unfolded it, the words leapt out at me, each one a dagger aimed straight at my heart. "Bet you can't keep her in the dark for a year," it read, followed by a signature I recognized, a friend of Michael's whom I had never particularly liked. My hands trembled as I clutched the note, the implications crashing over me like a tidal wave. I confronted Michael that night, the note held out like a weapon. His reaction was not one of surprise, but rather a weary acceptance, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "It was just a stupid bet," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth and love I had once cherished. "It didn't mean anything." His words, meant to absolve him, only deepened the chasm. Between us, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the foundation of our life together crumbling away. In that moment, I realized that the man I had married was a stranger to me, and the life I thought we were building together was nothing more than a fragile illusion. I spent the following days in a haze, moving through my routines like a ghost. My mother's concern grew. Her gentle inquiries met with silence as I grappled with the enormity of Michael's betrayal. The trust I had placed in him in our marriage now felt like a joke, a cruel twist of fate that left me questioning my own judgment. It was during one of my solitary walks through the park, a place I had often sought solace, that I met Henry. He was sitting on a bench, his gaze directed at the horizon, as if searching for something just beyond reach. There was a quiet strength about him, a sense of calm that drew me in. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, gesturing to the empty space beside him. He looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not at all," he replied, his voice warm and inviting. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the city a distant hum. Eventually, our conversation began, tentative at first, as if we were both testing the waters. I learned that he had been through his own share of heartache, his marriage ending in a tangle of misunderstandings and unmet expectations. As the days turned into weeks, our friendship blossomed, each meeting a balm to my wounded soul. Henry listened without judgment, his presence a reminder that not all relationships were built on deception. He shared stories of his life, his dreams and regrets, and in return, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't thought possible. It was during one of those conversations that he mentioned his business, a venture that had grown from a small startup into a thriving enterprise. I was surprised to learn of his success, having never imagined the quiet man on the park bench to be a billionaire. But it wasn't his wealth that drew me to him. It was his kindness, his ability to see beyond the scars life had left on my heart. As our friendship deepened, I began to see a future I had long since given up on. A life where trust and love were not just fairy tales, but realities we could build together. The decision to leave Michael was not an easy one, but it was necessary. I realized that staying in a marriage built on lies would only lead to further heartbreak. As I packed my things, I felt a sense of liberation, a newfound strength that came from choosing my own path, from reclaiming my life. Henry was there for me every step of the way, his support unwavering. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that perhaps true love was not the stuff of fairy tales, but something we could create one day at a time. I didn't know when the truth started to unravel, only that it did so like a slow, insidious leak from a faucet that drips in the dead of night, each drop echoing with the potential to flood. The realization didn't crash down on me in a torrential storm, but rather seeped into my consciousness. It began with small, thin G's, insignificant on their own, but impossible to ignore when pieced together. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first real crack appeared. I was tidying up our bedroom, folding freshly laundered sheets, when I found a receipt tucked between the pages of Henry's dog-eared copy of The Great Gatsby. The receipt was from a restaurant I'd never heard of. The date was from a day when Henry had claimed he was working late. I remember holding it in my hand, feeling the paper's thin fragility, and wondering if our life was just as delicate, as prone to tearing with the slightest pressure. I confronted Henry that evening, my voice surprisingly steady as I asked him about the dinner. He was charming as ever, his smile disarming, eyes crinkling at the corners. He spun a tale of a client meeting, of a spur-of-the-moment decision to go somewhere new. It was plausible, logical even. I wanted to believe him, wanted the peace that trust brings. But a nagging doubt lodged itself in my mind, and once there, it refused to leave. Henry and I had been married for nearly 28 years. We met in college, a whirlwind romance that seemed to defy the odds. He was the charismatic fraternity president, and I the bookish girl who spent more time in the library than at parties. He pursued me with a persistence that was both flattering and bewildering at the time. I remember the feel of his hand in mine, the promise of love and adventure in his eyes. Our life together was, by most accounts, enviable. We lived in a charming colonial in a quiet suburb, the kind where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were hard to keep. Our 2 children, Kevin and Lisa, were grown and living their own lives, leaving us to rediscover each other. Or so I thought. As the weeks passed, I began to notice more discrepancies. An unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirt collar, phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, a new password on his laptop. Each discovery was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I confided in my friend Margaret over coffee one afternoon. Margaret was the kind of woman who exuded warmth and wisdom, her life a tapestry of experiences both joyous and painful. She listened intently, her hands wrapped around her mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. Her advice was simple but profound. Trust your instincts, but don't jump to conclusions. Margaret was right, of course. I needed proof, something tangible to confirm or dispel my suspicions. So I did something I never imagined I would do. I went through Henry's phone. It was an invasion of privacy, one that felt wrong but necessary. I knew his passcode, an old anniversary date, and it was with a heavy heart that I unlocked his world. What I found was both expected and shocking. Messages to a woman named Jessica, filled with flirtations that spoke of more than just friendship. My heart sank further with each line, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the evidence of his betrayal. There were no explicit confirmations of an affair, but the tone was undeniable. I felt a sickening mix of anger, hurt, and humiliation. I confronted him that night, laying my cards on the table with a calmness I didn't feel. Henry's reaction was defensive, then apologetic. He insisted it was nothing, just harmless banter that had gotten out of hand. He swore he loved me, that he would never do anything to jeopardize what we had. For a moment, I almost believed him. Almost. But the doubt remained, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. I knew I couldn't go on like this, trapped in a limbo of uncertainty. I needed answers, the truth laid bare, no matter how painful it might be. The following weeks were a blur of confrontation and reconciliation. Henry promised to end things with Jessica, to focus on us and our marriage. I wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the life we had built together. But trust, once broken, is not easily mended. It requires time, effort, and genuine remorse. I was willing to forgive, but forgetting was another matter entirely. It was during this tumultuous time that I met Edward. He was a friend of a friend, visiting from out of town. We were introduced at a dinner party, one I had reluctantly attended in an attempt to distract myself from the chaos at home. Edward was older, with a calm, commanding presence and a kindness in his eyes that was immediately reassuring. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He listened with a patience and understanding that was rare, and when I found myself confiding in him about Henry, his response was both empathetic and insightful. He didn't offer solutions, didn't try to tell me what to do. Instead, he simply listened, providing a space for my thoughts and feelings to be heard. Our paths crossed again several weeks later at another social gathering. This time, Edward was more forthcoming about his own life. He was a widower, his wife of 30 years having passed away from cancer 2 years prior. His grief was still palpable, etched into the lines of his face, but there was also a resilience that spoke of a man who had faced great loss and emerged stronger. As we spent more time together, a friendship blossomed between us. It was innocent at first, a shared companionship that filled the void left by Henry's betrayal. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, I began to feel something more. It was terrifying and exhilarating, this burgeoning affection for a man who was not my husband. I found myself at a crossroads, caught between loyalty to a marriage that had once been my everything and the possibility of a new beginning with someone who saw me, truly saw me, for who I was. It was a choice I never imagined I would have to make, and the weight of it pressed down on me like a physical burden. Henry, for his part, seemed oblivious to the internal struggle I was facing. He was attentive, more so than he had been in years, as if sensing the shift in our dynamic but not understanding its cause. There were moments of tenderness, of shared laughter that reminded me of what we once had. But the shadow of his betrayal loomed large, casting doubt on every word, every gesture. As I contemplated the future, the possibility of leaving the life I had known for nearly 3 decades, I felt a deep, abiding sadness. Relationships are complex, messy things, filled with love and hurt, joy and disappointment. I had invested so much into my marriage, into the idea of a shared future with Henry. But sometimes I realized love is not enough. Sometimes the cost of staying is greater than the pain of leaving. It was a truth I was still coming to terms with, one step at a time, as I navigated the uncertain terrain of my heart.